All right, so pastors and Bible study leaders, you know that feeling, right? When you're prepping for this week and you're looking at Isaiah 64:8.
We are the clay, you are the potter, we are all the work of your hand.
Yeah, exactly. And you need something more than the same old interpretations. You need a fresh perspective.
Well, that's what this deep dive is for.
Right. We've got sermons from churches all over, and it's fascinating to see how different pastors approach this.
It's a familiar verse, but there's just so much to unpack here.
Okay, so let's start with Corinth Baptist Church. Their sermon really focused on the idea of transformation.
Yeah, they talked about how we need to be like clay, pliable in God's hands.
Willing to be molded and reshaped.
Exactly. They even connected it to 2 Corinthians 4:7, where Paul talks about us being earthen vessels,
Well, that's good.
carrying the treasure of Christ.
Okay, so it's not just about being shaped. It's about being shaped for a purpose.
Right, becoming vessels that can actually hold something precious.
I love the analogy they used. They compared spiritual complacency to a half-painted room.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, you start with all this energy and excitement, but then life gets in the way.
And pretty soon those paint cans are gathering dust.
Exactly. And they're saying, don't let your faith become that half-painted room. Don't let it fizzle out.
It's a powerful image, right? It really speaks to the need for ongoing transformation.
We're constantly allowing God to work on us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now Heaven Living Ministries had a slightly different angle. They focused on the contrast between the raw, flawed state of the clay.
And the beauty of the finished product.
Yes. They even talked about specific flaws that God, as the potter, might be working on in our lives.
Things like pride, selfishness, fear.
Right, and they made the point that these flaws aren't just abstract ideas. They have real consequences.
They affect our relationships, our ability to live out our faith.
They really emphasize those supporting verses, too.
Like Isaiah 45:9, where God says, don't question the potter.
In Ephesians 2:10, where we're reminded that we're God's handiwork created for good works.
Yes. And what I found interesting was their emphasis on the finished product being honorable.
What do you mean by that?
It suggests that God's not just fixing what's broken, he's creating something beautiful.
Something purposeful.
Something that reflects his glory.
Now, New Hope Christian Fellowship. They went with the Play-Doh analogy.
Oh, I love that one.
Me too. It's so relatable, especially for anyone who's ever watched a kid with Play-Doh.
You've got this shapeless lump, and in the right hands, it can become anything.
Exactly. They really highlighted the idea that surrender to God isn't about losing our individuality.
It's about allowing God, the master artist, to work with the unique material that is us.
They talked about the relationship between the clay and the potter.
That constant attention, the care and precision.
Yes. It reminded me that God isn't some distant being. He's intimately involved in our transformation.
Working in us and through us to bring about his purposes.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. One Living Church connected Isaiah 64:8 to the idea of reclaiming territory for God's kingdom.
Oh, wow, that's a new one.
They talked about how just as God shaped the first humans from the dust of the ground,
he's still shaping us today.
using us as instruments to bring life and growth to a world that desperately needs it.
Wow, so it's not just about our own personal growth.
It's about our role in God's bigger story.
The mission of expanding his kingdom and restoring creation.
And they went back to Genesis using those creation narratives.
To emphasize our connection to the earth, to the very dirt and clay that we're made of.
So we're not just clay in a metaphorical sense.
We're literally made of the same stuff.
It brings a whole new dimension to the verse, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a call to action.
All right, so we've got these churches talking about transformation, but they're also touching on some bigger themes.
Oh, absolutely. Themes of spiritual growth, surrender, and the interplay between our choices and God's sovereignty.
And this idea of obedience keeps coming up too.
Like, it's not enough to just passively exist as clay. We have to actively yield to the potter's hands.
Victory Baptist Church really focused on that in their sermon.
They called it the ongoing, sometimes challenging journey of discipleship.
They acknowledged that change can be uncomfortable, even painful at times.
Yeah, they talked about how the clay has to be molded, sometimes broken and reshaped to become what the potter envisions.
And just like clay, we might resist that process.
Try to hold on to our old shapes, our old ways of doing things.
They said it's in those moments of surrender when we relinquish control and allow God to work in us.
That's where we experience the most significant growth.
And that growth isn't always pretty or comfortable.
Sometimes it feels more like being broken down than built up. But it's in that brokenness, that surrender, that we truly become pliable in God's hands.
Like clay, ready to be molded.
Ready to be shaped.
And speaking of brokenness, Corinth Baptist Church brought up this idea that God sometimes has to break us in order to remake us
It's like he's taking those imperfections, those rough edges.
and using them to create something new and beautiful.
It reminds me of kintsugi.
Kintsugi.
Yeah, it's a Japanese art form where they repair broken pottery with gold.
Oh, wow.
So the cracks become part of the object's beauty and story.
I love it.
Our brokenness, when surrendered to God, can become part of our testimony.
Part of what makes us unique and valuable.
Exactly.
So we've talked about transformation, surrender, brokenness, even reclaiming territory for God's kingdom. But for all the pastors and Bible study leaders listening, how do we translate these ideas into something tangible? How do we bring Isaiah 64:8 to life for our congregations?
Well, I think object lessons are always a great way to make abstract concepts more concrete.
Yeah, like what?
Imagine bringing a lump of clay or even Play-Doh into your sermon or Bible study.
You mean like actually have it there?
Yeah, demonstrate the potter's process, maybe even let people try shaping the clay themselves.
I don't like that.
It's a hands-on way to experience the idea of being molded and shaped by God.
It's interactive.
Right. And you could even tie it into a time of prayer.
How so?
Invite people to reflect on areas of their lives where they sense God's shaping hand at work.
Okay, so everyone's got their hands in the clay and they're thinking about how God is shaping them.
Exactly. There's this shared vulnerability and openness to God's leading.
That's powerful.
And don't forget about visual art.
Oh, yeah.
Show images of pottery sculptures, maybe even examples of kintsugi.
So we're appealing to different learning styles.
Exactly. Art can speak to us on a deeper level, sometimes more than words can.
You could even have people bring in pieces of broken pottery.
And talk about how those pieces represent their own experiences of brokenness and healing.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
It creates a tangible connection between the verse and their own lives.
And speaking of personal connection, encourage people to share their own stories of transformation.
Testimonies.
Yes, times when they felt God shaping and molding them, even when it was difficult.
Those are always so powerful.
They remind us that we're not alone in this journey.
What about music?
Oh, music is essential. There are so many songs about surrender, transformation, being molded by God.
Weave those into your sermon or Bible study.
It creates an emotional connection, helps people internalize the message,
You could even have a hymn share.
where people share songs that speak to them about this verse.
Love it. Music is a universal language.
It really is. So it's all about finding creative ways to bring the ancient words of Isaiah to life for a modern audience.
Making it relevant.
And remember, the best illustrations often come from your own heart.
From your own experiences.
The more authentic and vulnerable we are, the more our congregations will connect.
So true.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about different interpretations of Isaiah 64:8, the recurring themes, even some practical applications for pastors and leaders. But there's one more thing I want to touch on before we wrap up. It's something that Corinth Baptist Church mentioned, and it really stuck with me.
You're talking about the danger of spiritual complacency, aren't you?
Yeah, that half-painted room analogy. It's such a vivid picture of what it looks like to settle into a routine and stop growing in our faith.
It's easy to get comfortable, right?
Oh, yeah, to think, okay, I've got this faith thing figured out, I've arrived.
But the Christian life,
Yeah,
it's not a destination.
it's a journey.
It's a process of becoming.
We're never truly finished products. God is always working in us, shaping us, refining us.
It's like that quote by Oswald Chambers. The greatest crisis we ever face is the surrender of our will to God's will.
Wow, surrender. That's key, isn't it?
It's in that surrender, that ongoing submission to the potter's hands, that we experience true transformation.
And that transformation, it's not just for us.
Right. Remember what One Living Church said about reclaiming territory for God's kingdom?
We're being shaped for a purpose,
To be agents of transformation in the world.
to bring God's love and grace to a broken and hurting world.
Exactly.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap of complacency? How do we stay pliable in God's hands, ready to be used for His purposes?
Well, I think it starts with a willingness to examine our lives, honestly.
To ask ourselves, what are those rough edges that God might be trying to smooth out?
Yeah. Where are we resisting His shaping hand?
Where are we clinging to our own will instead of surrendering to His?
And let's be honest, that kind of self-reflection, it can be uncomfortable.
It can bring up feelings of inadequacy, shame even.
But that's where grace comes in.
Grace to acknowledge our imperfections without condemning ourselves
Grace to trust that God isn't trying to break us down, but to build us up.
into something stronger, more beautiful.
It's about recognizing that God's refining fire, it's not meant to destroy us.
It's meant to purify us.
Exactly.
So as you prepare to teach on Isaiah 64:8, I encourage you to invite your congregations into this process of self-examination.
Challenge them to think about the rough edges in their own lives.
Those areas where they might be resisting God's shaping hand.
Encourage them to approach those areas with humility and surrender.
With trust.
To trust that God, the master potter, knows exactly what he's doing.
Even when it feels uncomfortable or painful.
Even when it feels like we're being broken.
Remind them that they are not passive lumps of clay.
They are active participants in this transformative process.
They have a choice.
They have the power to choose surrender.
To yield to God's shaping hand and allow him to create something beautiful and purposeful out of their lives.
That's power.
What a powerful message to share.
A message of hope, of transformation, of the incredible potential that lies within each of us when we surrender to the master potter.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Isaiah 64:8, I hope you're leaving with a renewed sense of wonder at the depth and richness of this simple verse.
And a fresh perspective to share with your congregations.
May this verse continue to challenge and inspire us as we seek to be more pliable in God's hands, more willing to be shaped and molded into vessels of honor for his kingdom.